The old woman on the bus didn't ask for a handout. She delivered a death sentence whispered directly into my ear. Before I could react, she pressed a cold metallic key into my palm, handing me over to an organization I didn't know existed. The 42 bus was a rolling metal sardine can during the evening rush. Every breath felt recycled, every shoulder jab inevitable. I was pressed right against the rear doors, mentally calculating how many stops until freedom, when I saw her. She was small, impossibly so, shrinking into a seat near the middle aisle, as if trying to avoid taking up space at all. Her coat looked like it had seen 3 decades of hard winters, patched in places with thread that didn't quite match. She was fumbling with a worn leather purse, her movements shaky, and I could hear the low, frustrated murmur she made when the fare box chimed impatiently. The driver, a man whose patience had clearly evaporated around noon, leaned back and yelled something sharp about holding up traffic. The line behind her tightened, people sighing dramatically, pulling out their transit cards and glowering. I wasn't rich, not by a long shot, just a data analyst trying to make rent, but the sheer desperation in her eyes flipped some internal switch. It wasn't just about the fare, it was about dignity, I realized. She was exhausted. I pushed past the guy next to me, muttered an apology, and reached the fare box just as the driver was about to close the doors. "Excuse me," I said, tapping the old woman's shoulder gently. She jumped, startled, looking up at me with eyes that were the color of faded denim. "Let me get that." Before she could protest, I slid 2 crumpled bills into the slot. The machine beeped its approval, a loud, decisive sound in the general cacophony. The pressure on the line behind me instantly dissolved. People grunted thanks as they rushed past, eager to reclaim their personal space. She didn't move. She just stared at the glowing green light where the money had gone, then slowly raised her gaze to mine. Her hands, gnarled and spotted with age, gripped the edges of her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "No, young man," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "You shouldn't have. I had it." "It's fine, truly," I insisted, giving her a reassuring nod, already trying to extract myself from the crowded middle section before the next wave of passengers boarded. "Consider it a good deed for a bad Tuesday." I turned to leave, but she reached out with surprising speed. Her fingers, dry, cold, almost skeletal, closed around my wrist. It wasn't a grasp of aggression, but of desperate connection, heavy with meaning. I froze, the rhythm of the bus suddenly seeming deafeningly loud. She pulled me slightly closer, forcing me to lean in over the adjacent seat, bringing her face just inches from mine. The smell wasn't unpleasant, just overwhelmingly old, like dust and lavender sachet left too long in a dark drawer. I braced myself for a story about needing medicine or rent money, the usual heartbreaking requests. But she didn't ask for anything. Her breath hitched, and her faded eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. The chaos of the bus, the music blasting from someone's headphones, the screech of the brakes, seemed to vanish. There was only her face, etched with lines that told stories I couldn't begin to decipher. Then she leaned in further, her mouth brushing the edge of my earlobe, and the whisper that followed was so soft, so laced with a chilling certainty that it bypassed my hearing and went straight into the deepest, most guarded part of my mind. "They are watching the transfers, dear boy. The package isn't safe. You need to get off at the next stop and walk south. Burn the briefcase. Do not, under any circumstance, open the lining." My blood turned instantly to ice water. They? Transfers? Package? This wasn't a prayer for help. This was a coded warning, delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who knew things she shouldn't. I looked wildly around the bus, but everyone was back to their phones or staring blankly ahead, completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred inches from me. The next stop was coming up, a busy commercial area I never used. I opened my mouth to ask who they were, but before a single sound could escape, the bus hissed to a stop. The old woman suddenly released my wrist, her expression snapping back to one of simple, confused frailty. She blinked twice, patted her purse, and mumbled, "Thank you, young man. Bless you." The doors hissed open right in front of me, and a sudden, inexplicable surge of urgency propelled me forward. I stumbled onto the pavement just as the doors closed behind me. I looked back through the thick glass, expecting to see her watching, but she was already obscured by the flow of people getting on. I started walking south, my heart hammering against my ribs, the cryptic words echoing in my skull. Burn the briefcase. But what briefcase? I was only carrying my laptop bag. Then my gaze fell to my left hand, the one she had held. Clutched tightly in my palm, deposited there somehow during that intimate, terrified exchange, was a small, heavy object. It wasn't cash. It was a key fob, old, heavy, metallic, and etched with an unfamiliar serpentine symbol I'd never seen before. And attached to the key fob was a small, stiff, folded piece of paper. I stopped dead center on the sidewalk, ignoring the stream of annoyed pedestrians. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, my eyes scanning the tight, precise handwriting. It read, Dock 7, midnight, the buyer is expecting the antique ledger. Dock 7, midnight, antique ledger. The words were stark, alien, and utterly terrifying in the context of a crowded city street. I looked down at the heavy key fob again, tracing the cold metal symbol with my thumb. It felt industrial, important, and profoundly dangerous. I checked my surroundings again. Had anyone followed me off the bus? No one seemed to be paying the slightest attention to the frantic man holding a mysterious artifact on a Tuesday evening. My analytical mind, the one that dealt in predictable spreadsheets and verifiable data, screamed that this was a prank, a mistake. Or perhaps I'd wandered into the middle of some elaborate, highly specific street theater. But the memory of that woman's touch, the sheer raw terror in her eyes, refused to let me dismiss it. That fear was real. I ducked into the nearest alleyway, the stench of dumpsters momentarily overpowering the metallic chill of the key. I needed to think. What ledger? I owned a laptop and a few paperbacks. The only briefcase I possessed was the battered one holding my work files currently sitting innocently under my desk across town. Burn the briefcase. I pulled out my phone, intending to call the police, to report a strange encounter, perhaps even an attempted extortion, though I hadn't been asked for money. But what would I say? An old woman on a bus whispered cryptic warnings about transfers and then gave me a key that unlocks something? They'd suggest therapy. I decided to play the scenario out, just in case. If this wasn't a joke, then the old woman believed I was someone else, or that I was involved in something I knew nothing about. And if they were watching transfers, it implied a system, surveillance, and likely something deeply illegal. The thought of tяжкое обвинение, or an обвинение по особо тяжким, flashed through my mind, fueled by the woman's desperation. I walked for another block, forcing myself into a slower rhythm, trying to appear like a regular commuter late for dinner. The key fob felt hot in my pocket. Dock 7 was down by the old industrial shipping yards, an area known for late-night activity, but usually the kind involving legitimate freight, not antique ledgers. As I neared the waterfront district, the atmosphere shifted. The bright lights of the central business area gave way to sodium vapor lamps casting long, sickly yellow shadows. The air tasted of salt and diesel. It was 10 p.m. I had 2 hours. I couldn't go home. If the briefcase was the target, they would already be watching my apartment or my office. I pulled out a $20 bill, enough for a quick, anonymous meal, and found a 24-hour diner near the train tracks. I needed time to decide if I was going to run or if I was going to confront this bizarre reality head-on. I sat in a dark booth near the back, nursing a weak coffee, the key fob resting next to my sugar dispenser. I pulled out the piece of paper one last time. Dock 7, midnight. The buyer is expecting the antique ledger. I realized then that I had a choice, a terrifying binary choice. Option A. Go home, pretend this never happened, and wait for whatever network the old woman belonged to, or whatever network I was supposed to belong to find me. Option B. Go to Dock 7. If I went to Dock 7, I might find out who the old woman was, what the package was, and maybe, just maybe, clear my name of whatever phantom crime they thought I was involved in. If I didn't go, The only certainty was that I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The Popitka Slomit Zhiznu Golovki. They might initiate if they believed I had double-crossed them. With a deep, shuddering breath, I downed the rest of the bitter coffee. It was nearing 11:30 p.m. I paid the check, leaving a generous tip, and headed toward the industrial zone. Dock 7 was exactly as I pictured. Vast, dark warehouses crisscrossed by rusting rail lines and surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. I parked my car 3 blocks away, in a dimly lit street where no one would notice it sit empty after midnight. I walked toward the docks, the key fob warm in my hand. The main lights were off, the area deserted save for the distant drone of a generator. I found a massive metal door, Warehouse 7, secured by a heavy-duty padlock. My heart hammered. This had to be a bluff. I fumbled with the key fob, holding it up to the lock, expecting nothing. But as the metal of the fob neared the padlock, I heard a faint, almost inaudible click. The heavy padlock swung open, falling silently to the concrete floor. It was the key. It unlocked the door. My hands were slick with sweat. I pushed the immense metal door inward just enough to slip through the gap, holding my breath. Inside, the air was cold and smelled strongly of brine and old wood. My eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom. In the center of the cavernous space, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging overhead, was a crate, and resting on top of the crate, gleaming dully, was a thick, leather-bound book, the Antique Ledger. As I took a hesitant step toward it, a voice sliced through the silence, sharp and utterly devoid of warmth. "You're late, Agent 4, and you don't look much like our usual contact. Where is the merchandise, and why did you bring the key fob to the exchange?" The voice had the cadence of authority and the steel of someone used to giving lethal commands. I froze, my body rigid, caught halfway between the open door and the glowing ledger. I strained my eyes in the dim light. Standing near the crate, emerging from the deep shadows behind the stack of shipping pallets, was a figure. Tall, impeccably dressed in dark, expensive clothing that seemed absurdly out of place among the rust and sea spray, and holding something that definitely wasn't an antique ledger. It was a dark, heavy object, clearly illegal weaponry, and he was aiming it directly at my chest. I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice cracking with sudden, genuine panic. "I'm not Agent 4. I think there's been a terrible mistake. I was on the 42 bus." The figure let out a short, humorless laugh. The 42 bus. A truly inspired alibi, even for our current level of operational decay. Listen carefully, Agent. We know you took the package from Maria. We know you have the access code, the ledger now. He took a deliberate step forward, the beam of a small tactical light catching the menacing shape of the object in his hand. The mention of Maria, the old woman, hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't made a mistake. She had set me up, or perhaps in a last-ditch effort she had tried to reroute a crisis. "I don't have a package," I pleaded, holding up my empty hands, careful not to let the key fob fall from my grip. "She gave me this key and told me to burn a briefcase. That's all. I don't know what ledger you mean." "Maria was careless," the man hissed, leveling the weapon fully. "She tried to pass off a civilian asset into an extraction scenario. Unacceptable. Now, the ledger, or we skip straight to interrogation. And believe me, friend, the network's interrogation techniques are far more memorable than any tяжкое обвинение you might face from the conventional authorities." My mind raced, desperately trying to connect the dots. Maria, the key, the ledger, the network. If I stayed, I'd be dead or captured by this dangerous Grupa. If I ran, I might still be hunted as Maria's accomplice. Suddenly, from the far side of the warehouse, the side opposite the entrance I had used, came a sound that cut through the tension. The high-pitched shriek of tearing metal, followed by the distinct sound of breaking glass and shouted professional commands in a language that wasn't English. "Internal security breach!" the man near the ledger yelled, momentarily distracted, swiveling his weapon toward the noise. "It can't be the perimeter team." This was my chance. I didn't hesitate. I didn't try to explain further. I spun on my heel and threw myself sideways, diving behind the nearest stack of empty wooden pallets, tucking myself low to the ground. The man shouted an obscenity and fired a warning shot that blasted through the wood where my head had been a second before. The sounds of the intrusion escalated. Now there were heavy footsteps, the metallic clatter of what sounded like organized pursuit, and more sharp, official-sounding orders, but not from the man near the ledger. These new voices sounded disciplined, organized, and far more frighteningly professional than the rogue operative I was currently dealing with. It was the Sluzhba Vnutrennei Bezopasnosti, perhaps closing in on both sides. As the two hostile factions began to engage each other in a chaotic firefight across the vast, dark warehouse floor, I realized what Maria had done. She hadn't just passed off a message. She had initiated a dead drop during an already volatile exchange, effectively triggering a confrontation between a criminal set and whatever government agency was trying to dismantle it. I saw my opening. The chaos was a shield. While the two armed parties were locked in a furious, blind exchange of fire, I scrambled along the edge of the warehouse, using the stacked containers as cover. I didn't look at the ledger. I didn't look at the gunfight. I looked only at the small sliver of the exterior world visible through a high, grimy window near the loading bay ramp. I reached the main loading ramp, found the secondary service door, unlocked, a final piece of luck, and burst out into the cool, salty night air. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, past the diners and the rail yards, back toward the relative safety of the main city grid. When I finally leaned against a storefront, gasping for breath, I realized I was empty-handed. I had left the key fob behind, lying near the open padlock. I had risked everything, not for the ledger or the package, but purely to escape the deadly vortex Maria had flung me into. I walked home the long way, feeling utterly hollowed out, swearing to never again offer help to a stranger on public transport. The next morning, I turned on the local news while making coffee. The lead story wasn't about a massive organized scheme collapsing. It was a small item buried near the end of the broadcast. Early morning fire damages a single empty warehouse structure near the waterfront. Authorities are investigating. No mention of arrests. No mention of agents or ledgers, just a fire. I went to work, logged into my predictable spreadsheets, and for the first time in years, I didn't look at the transfer logs with the usual professional detachment. I looked at them with a terrible new understanding of how thin the line truly was between data entry and espionage. I was clean. I was safe. But as I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the memory of Maria's cold fingers. I never saw the 42 bus again, but every time I paid my fare, I instinctively checked the faces around me just in case someone needed a very dangerous favor.